Private Leo Granger crouched in the darkness, separated from his platoon, surrounded by enemy forces closing in on every side. His radio was dead, his ammunition nearly gone, and hundreds of his brothers in arms were walking straight into a massacre. All he had was a worn Zippo lighter in his pocket and a desperate idea that would either save them all or mark his position for a bullet. What he did next with that simple flame would be written into military field manuals and talked about in war colleges for generations to come. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The hills of central Italy held their breath in the autumn of 1944, as if the very earth understood the weight of what was about to unfold. Private Leo Granger had never imagined himself a hero when he enlisted 2 years earlier in the small farming town of Millbrook, Indiana. He had been a quiet young man of 22 years, more comfortable with books than rifles, more at ease in the town library where he worked than on the parade grounds of basic training. His mother had cried for 3 days when he left, and his father, a veteran of the First Great War, had simply shaken his hand and told him to keep his head down and his eyes open. Leo had carried those words across the Atlantic, through the beaches of North Africa, and now into the treacherous mountain passes where the German army had dug in like ticks, refusing to be dislodged. The night of October 15th began like so many others in that endless campaign. Leo's company, part of the 34th Infantry Division, had been tasked with a reconnaissance mission along a ridge that intelligence believed was lightly defended. Captain Rourke, a hard-faced career officer from Boston, had briefed them with his usual economy of words. They were to move quietly through the valley, assess enemy positions, and report back before dawn. Simple enough on paper, but Leo had learned that nothing in war followed the script that comfortable men in rear headquarters wrote out. The patrol had moved out at 2200 hours, 18 men picking their way through the darkness with practiced silence. Leo, serving as one of the scouts, had taken point alongside Corporal Vincent Hayes, a wiry Texan who could read terrain like other men read newspapers. The air smelled of wet stone and pine, and somewhere in the distance an owl called out, its voice the only sound beyond the careful footfalls of trained soldiers. Leo's Springfield rifle felt heavy in his hands. Though he had carried it so long now, it should have been an extension of his body. His pack contained rations, ammunition, a first aid kit, and tucked in the innermost pocket, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the elements, 3 letters from his younger sister Margaret, letters he read and reread until he could recite them from memory. The ambush came with the sudden violence that separated the living from the dead in the space between heartbeats. One moment, the patrol was moving through a narrow draw between 2 ridges, and the next, the night exploded with machine gun fire and the distinctive crack of Mauser rifles. The German forces had been waiting in positions along both ridges, creating a killing field that caught the American patrol in its teeth. Leo hit the ground hard, his rifle clattering against stone as bullets tore through the air above him. He could hear men screaming, the wet sound of rounds hitting flesh, and Captain Rourke's voice bellowing orders that were swallowed by the chaos. Leo scrambled behind a boulder that seemed far too small to protect him, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. The muzzle flashes from the German positions lit the night like devil's fireworks, and in those brief illuminations he could see his comrades desperately trying to return fire, trying to find any cover in terrain that offered precious little. Corporal Hayes had made it to a depression 20 yards to Leo's left, and was firing controlled bursts toward the ridge. But even Leo's untrained tactical eye could see they were pinned down, outgunned, and in minutes they would all be dead. The firefight lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though to Leo it felt like hours compressed into moments. When Captain Rourke shouted the order to fall back, to scatter and evade, Leo needed no second invitation. He low-crawled away from his boulder, using every technique he had learned in training, moving during the loudest bursts of gunfire, when his movement would be masked. He had no clear sense of direction, knew only that he needed to put distance between himself and the ambush site. His uniform caught on thorn bushes, his hands scraped raw against rocks, but he kept moving. Driven by the most primal of instincts, the desperate animal need to survive. Leo crawled and ran and crawled again for what might have been an hour, or might have been 3. His sense of time shattered along with any coherent plan beyond putting one hand in front of the other, one boot ahead of the last. When he finally stopped, chest heaving and ears ringing from the gunfire, he found himself on a small plateau halfway up a ridge he did not recognize. The sounds of battle had faded to distant echoes, and in the new silence he could hear his own ragged breathing and the frantic thudding of his pulse. He was alone, separated from his unit, deep in enemy territory with no radio, no idea which direction led to friendly lines, and no plan beyond trying not to die in the next few minutes. The sky to the east was beginning to lighten with the false dawn that comes before true sunrise, that gray period when the world exists in neither darkness nor light. Leo took stock of his situation with the methodical approach his father had taught him when dealing with farm emergencies back in Indiana. He had his rifle and approximately 30 rounds of ammunition remaining. He had his pack with 2 days of rations and a canteen 3/4 full. He had his compass, though knowing north from south meant little when he did not know his precise location. He had a trench knife, a first aid kit, and in his jacket pocket, the Zippo lighter his father had carried through France in 1918, and passed to him the day he left for basic training. Leo found a cleft in the rocks that provided concealment and hunkered down to think. His training said to move at night and hide during daylight, to work his way back toward American lines using the compass and whatever landmarks he could identify. But something gnawed at him, some instinct that told him the ambush they had walked into was not a random encounter. The German forces had been waiting, positioned perfectly to catch a patrol moving through that particular draw. That suggested intelligence, preparation, and a larger plan. If the Germans knew American forces were operating in this area, if they had prepared one ambush, they would have prepared others. As the sky continued to brighten, Leo carefully worked his way higher up the ridge, moving from cover to cover, every nerve alert for any sound or movement that might signal enemy presence. Near the top, he found a position behind a tumbled pile of boulders that gave him a view down into the valley below and across to the neighboring ridges. What he saw there made his blood run cold and confirmed his worst fears. In the growing light, he could see German positions, dozens of them, machine gun nests and mortar pits and concealed artillery pieces, all positioned to cover the main valley floor. More than that, he could see what they were covering, the approach to the valley, the route that intelligence back at headquarters believed was the best path for a major advance. Leo's hands shook as he pulled out his small field notebook and began sketching what he saw, marking positions with the same careful attention to detail he had once used when cataloging books in the Millbrook Library. The Germans had created an elaborate trap, a killing zone that would slaughter any force that tried to move through that valley. And Leo knew with sick certainty that his own division, thousands of men who had become his brothers over months of fighting, were scheduled to make exactly that advance. The operation had been briefed to them 3 days earlier. They were to push through this sector, exploit what command believed was a weak point in the German lines, and drive toward the next major town. Instead, they would drive straight into a meat grinder that would make the ambush Leo's patrol had walked into look like a minor skirmish. He had to warn them. The thought came with crystalline clarity, even as his mind reeled with the impossibility of the task. He was one man, miles behind enemy lines, with no functioning radio and no realistic way to make it back to friendly territory before the advance began. Even if he tried to move immediately, tried to retrace his route through terrain he barely knew, past German patrols that would be searching for survivors from the ambush, he would never make it in time. The advance was scheduled for that afternoon, timed to take advantage of air support that would be available during daylight hours. He had perhaps 6 or 7 hours at most, and the journey back would take at least 12, even if everything went perfectly, which nothing ever did in war. Leo sat behind his boulder pile as the sun climbed higher, his mind racing through options and discarding them, one after another. He could try to sabotage some of the German positions, but one man with a rifle would accomplish nothing beyond getting himself killed and alerting the enemy that their trap had been discovered. He could try to circle around and approach from a different angle, but the terrain and time made that equally impossible. Every practical option led to the same conclusion, that he was helpless to prevent the disaster he could see coming, as clearly as if it had already happened. Hundreds of men, maybe thousands, were going to die, and he was going to sit here behind these rocks knowing he could have stopped it if only he could bridge the impossible distance between where he was and where he needed to be. The sun was fully up now, warming the rocks and burning off the morning mist. Leo could see the valley floor clearly, could trace the route the advance would take, could almost see in his mind's eye the way it would unfold. American forces would enter the valley in column formation, expecting light resistance based on faulty intelligence. The Germans would let them come, would wait until maximum forces were committed to the killing zone, and then they would open fire from three sides with everything they had. Artillery would seal the exits, machine guns would cut down anyone trying to advance or retreat, and mortars would systematically destroy any cover. It would be a massacre, plain and simple, and every tactical bone in Leo's body screamed at the wrongness of watching it happen, when he knew, when he had the information that could prevent it, when sitting here with that knowledge made him complicit in the deaths that were coming. It was in that moment of despair, as Leo's mind spun through the same impossible calculations again and again, that his hand unconsciously moved to his jacket pocket and closed around the Zippo lighter. He pulled it out, the metal warm from his body heat, and looked at it properly for the first time in weeks. It was scratched and dented, its chrome finish worn away in places from 2 wars' worth of use. His father had told him it had saved his life once, when a piece of shrapnel meant for his chest had hit the lighter instead, denting it but deflecting the metal away from his heart. Leo had carried it more as a talisman than anything practical, rarely using it since cigarettes were in short supply and he preferred to save them for moments of real stress. He flicked it open, struck the wheel, and watched the flame spring to life, steady and bright in the morning air. Something about that simple flame triggered a memory from his basic training, from the endless classes on field craft and survival that had seemed so tedious at the time. He remembered a grizzled sergeant, a veteran of the First War like his father, demonstrating signaling techniques. Morse code could be transmitted through any medium that allowed for controlled intervals of visibility, flags, mirrors, even lights in sequence. The sergeant had joked that a man with a lighter or a torch could signal across miles if the conditions were right and someone was watching. Leo's breath caught as an idea formed, insane and desperate but possible, just barely possible. He knew Morse code. Every soldier learned at least the basics, though few became truly proficient. Leo, with his library background and natural aptitude for patterns and systems, had taken to it more easily than most. He could tap out messages on practice keys in his sleep, but tapping keys was very different from trying to signal across miles of hostile territory with nothing but a cigarette lighter. Could it even work? Would anyone be watching? Would they understand what they were seeing if they did see it? Leo carefully studied the terrain, using his compass to orient himself properly. His position gave him a clear line of sight to the west, back toward where American lines should be positioned. The distance was formidable, perhaps 5 or 6 miles, but the elevation gave him an advantage. Light signals worked best when elevated, when the source was above the observer, when the beam could cut through intervening air without obstruction. The morning sun was behind him now, rising in the east, which meant any signal he sent westward would be moving from brightness toward relative shadow, making it potentially more visible. The conditions were not ideal, would never be ideal, but they were the only conditions he had. His hands shook as he began to work through the mechanics of what he was attempting. The Zippo's flame was small but bright. If he could create controlled bursts of visibility, blocking and revealing the flame in the precise intervals that Morse code demanded, he might be able to send a message that anyone with field glasses and knowledge of the code could read. The message had to be simple, had to be clear, had to convey in the fewest possible letters the critical information that would save thousands of lives. Ambush was obvious, but was it enough? Did it convey the scale, the urgency, the absolute necessity of stopping the advance? He settled on a message that took him 10 minutes to perfect. 5 words that said everything that needed saying. Ambush Valley, massive force, abort advance. Leo positioned himself so that the boulder pile would block the flame from being visible to the German positions below, while leaving it exposed to the west. He cupped the lighter in both hands, creating a shield that would allow him to control exactly when and for how long the flame was visible. His training came back to him as he began to rehearse the message. Morse code operated on a simple principle. Dots were short signals, dashes were long signals 3 times the duration of a dot, and spaces between letters and words were carefully timed to allow for clarity. The word ambush began with A, dot dash, followed by M, dash dash. He practiced the rhythm without lighting the flame, his hands opening and closing in the precise intervals, until he felt confident he could execute it cleanly. The sun climbed toward mid-morning as Leo began his signal, flicking the lighter to life and starting the slow, careful work of tapping out his message letter by letter. Dot dash for A, pause, dash dash for M, pause, dash dot 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 for B. He worked through ambush, then allowed a longer pause for the space between words, then started on valley. The work was harder than he had anticipated. His hands cramped from holding the uncomfortable position. The wind kept trying to blow out the flame, forcing him to restart letters. His eyes watered from staring at the small, bright point of fire. But he kept going, working through the message once, twice, 3 times, establishing a rhythm. Hoping against hope that somewhere out there someone was watching. Someone with field glasses and knowledge of the code and the authority to act on what they saw. Time became elastic as Leo signaled. He worked through his message again and again, refueling the lighter when it ran dry, his supply of lighter fluid dropping as the morning wore on. He had no way to know if anyone was receiving his desperate transmission, no way to verify that his effort was anything more than an exercise in futility. The German positions below remained active but quiet, soldiers going about the routine business of war, unaware that one man on a ridge above them was trying to destroy their carefully laid plans. The sky remained clear, the visibility good, and Leo's hands moved through the practiced motions with mechanical precision, even as his mind spun with doubt and desperate hope in equal measure. Around what Leo estimated was 1,100 hours, when his lighter fluid was nearly exhausted, and his hands were so cramped he could barely move them, he saw something that made his heart leap into his throat. In the valley to the west, visible now in the bright midday sun, dust was rising. Not the random dust of wind or animals, but the organized dust of vehicles moving in column. The advance was beginning. He had failed. His signal had either not been seen, or not been understood, or not been believed, and now thousands of men were moving into the trap he had tried so hard to warn them about. Leo's hands fell to his sides, the lighter extinguishing. As he watched the dust clouds grow larger, marking the progress of an army moving toward its destruction. But then something changed. The dust clouds slowed, then stopped. Leo squinted against the glare, wishing desperately for binoculars or field glasses, anything that would let him see what was happening in detail. The columns had halted. Why would they halt unless something had changed, unless someone had received his message and was acting on it? New dust began to rise, this time moving perpendicular to the original advance. Artillery pieces, Leo realized with growing excitement. They were repositioning artillery. He watched as the pattern became clear. American forces were not advancing into the valley, but were instead setting up to shell it from positions outside the killing zone. The German forces below Leo's position seemed to realize something was wrong at almost the same moment. He could hear voices calling in German, could see soldiers moving to their guns, officers gesturing toward the valley mouth where the expected American advance should have appeared, but had not. The trap had been sprung, but had caught nothing. And now the trappers were realizing they had been discovered. Leo pressed himself flat against the rocks as the first American artillery shells began to fall, impacting on the German positions below with devastating accuracy. Someone had not only received his signal, but had understood it completely, had grasped the scope of what he was reporting, and had acted with the decisive speed that meant the difference between victory and catastrophe. The bombardment lasted for nearly an hour, systematic and thorough, walking through the German positions with the careful attention of gunners who had been given excellent intelligence about exactly where targets were located. Leo huddled in his cleft in the rocks, hands over his ears, as the world below him was transformed into fire and thunder. He felt no joy in the destruction, understood too well that the men dying down there were sons and brothers and fathers like himself. But he also understood that this was war, that those same men had been prepared to slaughter thousands of Americans, and that sometimes survival meant being harder than you wanted to be, colder than you thought you could be. When the bombardment finally ceased and an eerie quiet settled over the valley, Leo cautiously raised his head. The German positions were devastated. Artillery pieces twisted into scrap metal, machine gun nests collapsed into smoking craters. Some positions were still intact enough to pose a threat, but the trap had been broken. the teeth pulled from the ambush before it could close on its intended victims. As Leo watched, American infantry began to advance, this time properly supported by armor and artillery, this time moving with the caution of soldiers who knew they were entering contested ground. The battle that followed was sharp but relatively brief. The German forces, their careful plans destroyed and their positions compromised, could not mount effective resistance against a prepared assault. Leo remained in his rocky hiding spot as the battle played out below, knowing that moving now would be more dangerous than staying put. American forces were jumpy after walking up to an ambush. German forces were desperate and trigger-happy in defeat. And a lone soldier moving between the lines would likely be shot by one side or the other before he could identify himself. He waited through the afternoon as American forces secured the valley and began pushing beyond it, exploiting the breakthrough that had been handed to them by the destruction of the German trap. Only as evening began to fall did Leo risk moving, carefully working his way down the ridge toward where American positions had consolidated. He nearly got shot anyway when a sentry spotted him and challenged. Leo dropped his rifle and shouted the password of the day at the top of his lungs, hands raised, praying the nervous private with the Thompson submachine gun would recognize him as friendly before reflexively pulling the trigger. The moment stretched into eternity before the sentry lowered his weapon and called for a corporal. Within minutes, Leo found himself surrounded by soldiers from his own division, men slapping him on the back and shouting questions, wanting to know where he had been and how he had survived and what he had seen. They brought him to a field headquarters that had been set up in a commandeered farmhouse, where Captain Rourke looked up from a map table with an expression Leo had never seen on the hard-faced officer's features. It was something like wonder mixed with relief. The captain stood and crossed the room in 3 strides and did something else Leo had never seen him do. He shook Leo's hand with both of his own and held it while he spoke. They had received the signal, Rourke explained. A forward observation post, equipped with high-powered optics, had spotted unusual light flashes from the ridge and had called it in. A signals officer, a former telegrapher in civilian life, had recognized it as Morse code and had started transcribing. When the message became clear, when they understood what Leo was reporting, wheels had been set in motion with remarkable speed. Intelligence had confirmed that Leo's patrol had walked into an ambush and that several scouts were still unaccounted for. The combination of lost scouts and a Morse code warning of massive German forces in the exact area where a major advance was planned had been enough to halt the operation and redirect the artillery. Leo had saved the division, Rourke told him in a voice that carried through the farmhouse and silenced all other conversation. Conservative estimates suggested the ambush would have killed or wounded 3,000 men in the first 30 minutes. The subsequent fighting to extract survivors and secure the valley would have doubled those casualties and set the advance back by weeks. Instead, American forces had taken fewer than 200 casualties, taking positions that should have cost them 10 times that number. And they had done it because one scout with a cigarette lighter had refused to give up, had found a way to bridge an impossible distance with nothing but flame and knowledge and desperate determination. The lighter itself became something of a legend in the days that followed. Leo was pulled from the line and sent back to division headquarters, where a parade of officers wanted to hear his story, wanted to examine his sketch of the German positions, wanted to understand exactly how he had managed to signal over such distance with such a simple tool. A signals major became obsessed with recreating the feat, setting up experiments to measure visibility ranges and optimal signaling conditions. Within 2 weeks, a provisional field manual entry was being drafted on improvised light signaling, with Leo's experience cited as proof of concept. The Zippo lighter was photographed for the manual, and Leo was told it would be sent to the Signal Corps school in Fort Monmouth after the war to be used in training. Leo was also recommended for the Silver Star, though the paperwork would take months to process through the military bureaucracy. He did not particularly care about medals. What mattered to him was that he had been in a position to do something, had found a way to do it, and because of that, thousands of men he would never meet had gone home to families they would not have seen if the ambush had succeeded. His father would have understood that, Leo thought. His father who had carried the lighter through his own war, who had passed it to his son with the quiet hope that it would protect him as it had protected its original owner. The story might have ended there, with Leo rotating back to his unit and continuing to serve out the war in the way that thousands of other soldiers did, contributing their small pieces to the vast machinery of victory. But the nature of war is that nothing stays contained, and Leo's cigarette signal, as it came to be called, in the unofficial histories soldiers told around campfires, took on a life of its own. Veterans returning home after the war carried the story with them. The provisional field manual entry became official and was expanded in post-war revisions. The Signal Corps, recognizing the value of improvised communication in situations where conventional methods failed, began including instruction on light-based Morse signaling in its curriculum, and they used Leo's lighter as a physical teaching tool, a tangible reminder that sometimes the simplest instruments could accomplish what the most sophisticated equipment could not. Leo himself returned to Millbrook after the war ended in 1945. He walked into the library where he had once worked to find his old position waiting for him, held by the head librarian who had promised his mother he would keep it available. He settled back into the quiet routine of cataloging and shelving and helping patrons, and he found that the work soothed something in him that the war had left raw. He married Margaret's best friend, a school teacher named Catherine, who had waited for him with a patience that humbled him. They had 3 children, raised them in the same small town where Leo had grown up, and Leo told them stories about the war when they were old enough to understand, careful always to emphasize not the violence or fear, but the moments of connection, the times when men found ways to help each other survive the unsurvivable. The lighter, returned to him after the Signal Corps finished with it, sat on his desk in the library for the rest of his working life. It did not work anymore, its mechanism worn out from years of use, but he kept it as a reminder of what his father had told him before he left. Keep your head down and your eyes open. In the end, that was what had made the difference. He had kept his eyes open even when giving up would have been easier. He had seen what needed to be done and had found a way to do it with the tools he had available. That, Leo believed, was not heroism in the conventional sense, but simply the stubbornness of refusing to accept that some problems had no solutions. In 1968, the Army invited Leo to speak at the Signal Corps school about his experience. By then, he was 46 years old, gray beginning to show in his hair, his body carrying the soft weight of middle age and comfortable civilian life. He stood in front of a classroom of young soldiers and told them the story of a night in Italy when everything had gone wrong, and one small light had been enough to bridge the distance between death and survival. He showed them the lighter, passed it around so they could feel the weight of it, the reality of something so simple being the instrument of salvation for thousands of men who had never known they were in danger. The young soldiers held it with a reverence that surprised Leo, and he understood then that what he had done had transcended the specific circumstances of one battle and one war. It had become a story about resourcefulness, about refusing to give up, about finding ways to communicate when communication seemed impossible. Those were lessons that had value beyond any particular conflict, lessons that would serve these young men, whether they ended up in rice paddies in Southeast Asia, or in Cold War tensions in Europe, or in the 1,000 other places American forces were deployed. When Leo died in 1997 at the age of 75, the obituary in the Millbrook Sentinel mentioned his service in the Second World War and the Silver Star he had received for his actions in Italy. His family buried him with full military honors, and the flag that draped his casket was folded and presented to Catherine, who held it against her chest, and remembered the young man who had come home from the war, quieter than he had left, but fundamentally unchanged in the ways that mattered. The lighter, which had sat on his desk for 50 years, went to his oldest son, who understood its value had nothing to do with its monetary worth and everything to do with the story it carried. The reminder that sometimes the smallest flame could light the way out of the darkest trap. Military historians studying the Italian campaign would note in their analyses that the advance of October 19, 1944 succeeded beyond all reasonable expectations, that American forces broke through German defensive lines that should have held for weeks, and that casualty figures for the operation were remarkably low given the terrain and enemy strength. The official histories attributed this to excellent intelligence and aggressive artillery deployment. They were not wrong, but they were incomplete. The intelligence had come from one man with a field notebook and determination. The artillery deployment had happened because that same man had found a way to send a message when sending messages should have been impossible. 5 words tapped out in Morse code with a cigarette lighter's flame. Ambush Valley, massive force, abort, advance. 39 letters that had saved thousands of lives and changed the course of a battle, a campaign, perhaps in some small way, the war itself. The field manual entry on improvised light signaling remained in circulation long after the Second World War ended, updated and revised, but retaining the core example of Leo Granger's cigarette signal. Generations of Signal Corps soldiers learned about it in their training, and some of them went on to use similar techniques in Korea, in Vietnam, in the Gulf, in Afghanistan. In every conflict where modern communication technology failed, and soldiers had to fall back on the basics. In military archives, the original after-action reports from that October day in Italy were preserved, documenting the strange Morse code light signal that had been spotted from a ridge 5 miles distant, the decision to act on it despite initial skepticism, and the results that had vindicated that decision. Researchers studying military communications could read those reports and see in precise official language the outline of an extraordinary moment when one man's refusal to accept impossibility had made the difference between catastrophe and victory. The farmhouse where Leo had reported after his ordeal no longer stood by the end of the 20th century, torn down decades earlier and replaced by modern construction. The ridge where he had signaled was now part of a hiking trail that wound through hills made peaceful by the passage of time and the fading of old conflicts. Sometimes hikers would stop there, drawn by the view down into the valley below, and they would admire the scenery without knowing that in that exact spot, a young man from Indiana had once crouched behind rocks and used his father's lighter to tap out a message that had echoed across miles and years, a message that had begun as a desperate hope and had become a demonstration of what was possible when someone refused to believe that distance and circumstance could silence what needed to be said. The flame from that lighter had long since gone out, but the light it had cast that October morning had never really faded. It had simply changed form, becoming a story, then a lesson, then a reminder that would be carried forward by everyone who heard it and understood what it meant. Sometimes the simplest tools, wielded with knowledge and determination and an absolute refusal to give up, could accomplish what seemed impossible. Sometimes 5 words were enough to change everything. Sometimes one small light could guide an army out of a trap and into the future that would have been lost without it.